Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Yesterday, there was an enormous amount of information to unpack in the Path of Exile 2 livestream. If you missed my summary of that, it is a pretty substantial video, 3/4 of an hour, but I'll put a link to it at the end of this video so that you can check that out if you're interested. Today though, what I wanted to do is go through some of the information that people have taken as freeze frames from that, and that have combined all over on the Path of Exile subreddit and the Path of Exile 2 subreddit. Now, a lot of this consolidation was stuff that I had missed. That's one of the things I knew would happen when we were talking about the live stream yesterday. There's so much information in there that it's easy to miss individual things. And this information is being consolidated by two people, Vestinor for the skills and Chlorine Trifluoride for the Ascendancies. Anyways, let's have a quick look at the information that we've got. We've got information on 12 different Ascendancies and on a whole chunk of different skill gems. The skill gems are what we'll start with first, and we'll have a look firstly at the bow ones in a little bit more depth, and then we'll go through the occult ones and a few other categories more quickly. All we've really got here is names to go off, but for some of these gems, we've seen them in action in Path of Exile 2 teasers as well, and sometimes we know a little bit more about them for other reasons. Additionally, on top of that, some of these gems are ones that have been seen in Path of Exile 1, and it's possible, but not guaranteed, that they'll work in a similar way in Path of Exile 2. Now, you'll notice that these are consolidated into tiers. The way that gems are going to work in Path of Exile 2, you don't get a skill gem drop for you. So you're running through the campaign, or maybe even you're running through the end game. Instead of getting a barrage gem dropping for you, you'll get a gem and it will be leveled up to a certain limit. Now, once you get that gem to drop for you, you can carve any skill on it up to the level of the gem. For example, if you find a level 8 gem while you're in Act 3, now I have no idea whether you would find a level 8 gem or not there. I'm not sure of the exact timing in progression that you'll get each of these new gems. But if you do find one, then you'll be able to carve any of the rank 1, 3, 5, or 7 skills onto it. But you will not be able to carve Rain of Arrows onto it because it's not high enough level. Likewise, you won't be able to carve on Shock Chain Arrow because that requires you to have a level 11 gem in order to use it. So what this is going to mean is that earlier in the game, you'll be locked into using certain lower level skill gems. These will still level up as you equip them, and so they will eventually become better, but some of the options won't be available. Especially the more complicated options, they tend to be the ones that take the longest to unlock the ability to use. The further that you get through the game though, the more access you will have to some of this opt-in complexity that's tied to some of these higher tier gems. There are also gems that require rank 13. We'll see some of those when we come over to have a look at the occult gems that are available. Now, we don't have every single one of these gem lists available to us. It's also possible that some of these will not be available on day 1 of early access. Additionally, the game will recommend something based upon your starting class to you, but you're not required to stick with that. For example, if you elect to start as a mercenary, then crossbow skill gems will be something that the game recommends that you use, but you're not going to be forced to use them. And if you've got a weird build in mind that wants to use occult gems, then you will be able to select an occult gem. Instead, you'll be able to do that starting from very early in the game. The game might give you a, "Are you sure you want to take this option?" warning. We'll see exactly the way that that works, but you will have the ability to say, yes, I'm certain. I want my mercenary to be summoning the undead rather than firing a crossbow. You will have that sort of flexibility in Path of Exile 2. Whether it's good or not is an open question. All that out of the way, let's have a look at what gems are available in the bow section. We have Lightning Arrow, which is returning from Path of Exile 1. It's a very simple projectile attack, but it's one that has a very powerful additional rider on it. And that is that in Path of Exile 1, it also hits an area behind the target that you strike, and it converts some of the physical damage from your bow into lightning damage, and this conversion will mean that the small amount of physical damage your bow intrinsically does, some of that damage is converted into lightning, which then can also benefit from all of these lightning damage enhancers that your character might have on it. So that's Lightning Arrow, very simple attack, but a very solid one. We don't know exactly how it's going to work in Path of Exile 2, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's quite similar. Escape Shot is a gem that can be used to escape a combat, but that's not going to be its main use in an ARPG. This freezes an area in front of you, but it also propels you backwards when you're using it, and it seems like it's a quite slow attack. This is something you're going to want to find the right moment to fire off, and when you do get that moment right, you'll be rewarded by freezing a bunch of dangerous enemies so they can't do anything to you for a little while, and if you're playing a very offensively minded build, you might be able to destroy them before they unfreeze. There'll also be a number of shenanigans you can pull with this. Freeze an enemy, then use another skill that combos and does more damage to frozen enemies, or anything along those sorts of lines. Poison Burst Arrow looks like it will be a spiritual successor to PathOfExile 1's Toxic Rain, and Lightning Rod in many ways strikes me as a spiritual successor to a very different type of skill from PoE 1. This is Orb of Storms. Orb of Storms, for those that aren't familiar, it conjures a marker at the ground where you are, and every time you cast a lightning spell near it, it then unleashes a jolt of electricity that damages enemies that are near you. It has a pretty nasty cooldown on it. It's a really good skill very early in the game, but one that people don't usually play all the way at endgame. Anyways, Lightning Rod looks like it has that same combo feel, but instead of being a tool for spellcasters, it's a tool for range-based characters to use. After that, we have a number of skills that not all that much is known about, although Snipe and Barrage are skills that exist in PathOfExile 1. So you have Stormcaller Arrow, Snipe, Vine Arrow, Barrage, Toxic Growth, and Electrocuting Arrow. Then we have a couple of skills that are very different in the rank 7 skills. Sniper's Mark and Voltaxic Mark are skills that in PathOfExile 1 would not be bow tagged. Now, Sniper's Mark, which exists in PathOfExile 1, is a skill that would be used with bows primarily, but fundamentally the game decides it's a curse first and foremost, so we're going to tag it as a curse skill. In PoE 2, it looks like it's being categorized in amongst the skills that it's designed to go with, rather than being separated out as a curse skill. It also may mark a little bit of a philosophical shift. Technically, Sniper's Mark is not a bow skill in PathOfExile 1, and so it is not categorized as one. However, in PathOfExile 2, it is categorized as one because that's where the spirit of the skill is. And that may be a very important little shift that's designed to make the game a little bit more approachable for newer players. Additionally, we have Gas Arrow here, which I believe I have heard, and I can't verify that I'm right on this, but I believe that I've heard that this is going to be somewhat of a successor to Caustic Arrow from PathOfExile 1. So something that's going to deal chaos damage over time, and that may or may not have an attached hit component. If it does have an attached hit component, then that's something you could conceivably try to scale through the use of either poison or just through physical damage scaling or chaos conversion, but that's something that may not exist in PathOfExile 2. Rank 9, we're seeing Rain of Arrows returning from PathOfExile 1. Wouldn't surprise me if this is toned down a little bit from how many areas it can hit in PathOfExile 1, but we'll see on that. Ice Shot, which is very similar to Lightning Arrow in PathOfExile 1. And then Tornado Shot at rank 11 is also a returning gem. Whether these work similar or different to PathOfExile 1 is entirely an open question. And then we've got Detonating Arrow and Shock Chain Arrow, which, to the best of my knowledge, nothing is really known about either of them. So they'll be things that we can experiment with once PathOfExile 2 goes live, or potentially once we find out a little bit more about these skills. In the Occult skills, we have an interesting combination. Here we have a number of things that are themed around chaos damage, and also a number of things that are themed around undeath. In PathOfExile 1, these would not be considered the same category, but in PathOfExile 2, they are because they're both intended to be used by the same class. One thing I will say about a number of these skeleton gems is that I don't know how accurately these compare to PathOfExile 1's summon skeletons. There may or may not be something that's similar there, and it may be the case that something like Skeletal Brute, which is all the way down in rank 13, is more of the spiritual heir to PathOfExile 1's summon skeletons and Vaal summon skeletons. Of course, we're going to find out more about that when we get to play around with these skills. One important thing to know about things that summon permanent minions is that they are going to reserve a new resource called Spirit. Spirit is very similar to Mana Reservation in PathOfExile 1, but it's not going to undermine your ability to cast your spells. Instead, it's simply going to be a hard limit on how many permanent effects you can have active on your character at once. Things like auras, things like permanent minions, and if you can increase your spirit, which there are a number of ways you can do, that's going to be a spiritual successor to getting Mana Reservation efficiency or Life Reservation efficiency in PathOfExile 1. So a very different mechanic, but same fundamental idea. They want to constrain the amount of permanent effects that you can generate so that we don't have a situation where everyone feels they have to run every single permanent effect that they can. There are a number of skills on the Occult gem list that are returning from PathOfExile 1. There's Contagion, Unearth, Enfeeble, Essence Drain, Raise Zombie, Detonate Dead, Vulnerability, Despair, Bone Offering, Hex Blast, and finally at rank 13 there's Soul Offering, which may or may not be a repackaging of the familiar Spirit Offering from PathOfExile 1. It's plausible that many of these do something very similar to what they do in PathOfExile 1, but it's also plausible that they could change quite a bit. Be interesting to see exactly where Grinding Gear Games decide to go with that. In terms of other things that look really interesting here, Skeletal Arsonist sounds cool. Like, who hasn't wanted to see a skeleton go around lighting fires? This is not a class fantasy that I was thinking of before hearing about that gem, but it's one I'm certainly interested in now. Bind Spectre sounds like it could be very similar to PathOfExile 1's Raise Spectre. And we also have the Skeletal Cleric, which just sounds really, really cool. We'll see whether that's good or not, but it is something that is on my shortlist to try out when PathOfExile 2 goes live. In the Quarterstaff cluster, we have a number of skills that are thematically tied to the Monk. Now, the Monk is a class in PathOfExile 2 that feels very, very different to a lot of monks that I'm familiar with from tabletop RPGs. These are not necessarily going to be unarmed fighters. They're going to be using a quarterstaff almost exclusively. And on top of that, they've got a number of just weird and wonderful things that feel almost like elemental magic, rather than being the more typical martial stereotype that I think of when I, at least, think of the monk as a concept in fantasy. So this is going to be something that's very, very different to anything that exists in PathOfExile 1, and it's also going to be really interesting to explore. Glacial Cascade is a spell in PathOfExile 1, but it looks like it's being designed as something that an attack-oriented monk can use. So that's something I'm interested to learn a lot more about. Tempest Spell is one of the skills here that a lot of monk shenanigans will be based around. You conjure a Tempest Spell, it's a static thing on the ground, and every time that you hit it, it reflects damage to other enemies that are nearby, causing them to suffer a whole bunch of damage because you're able to strike the enemy and also the Tempest Spell at the same time. And this is going to really, really reward people who can precisely position the Tempest Spell in a position where they can very easily hit it and the boss at the same time in boss fights, or where they can hit it and the tanky rare monster at the same time. And particularly at the highest skill levels, you're going to find people who are going to set this up in encounters with 2 or 3 monsters and position it very precisely so that they can strike everything at the same time and maximize the damage in order to kill those monsters as quickly as possible. I feel like this is probably going to be one of the highest skill ceiling skills in the entirety of PathOfExile 2. We don't know everything that's coming, but this one looks like it's going to be extremely high. One of the really cool things that's easy to miss is Hand of Chayula is going to be a skill here. And this is going to tie in a bit as well with the fact that the monk has an entire ascendancy, the Acolyte of Chayula. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with PathOfExile 1, Chayula is a boss that's encountered in Breach content in PathOfExile 1. Breach is returning in PathOfExile 2, but it's being very substantially overhauled, and Chayula is no longer going to be associated with it. Chayula is a dreamer entity that's fairly malicious and tied to both physical and chaos damage. Chayula is one of the most dangerous of the monsters associated with the Breach mechanic in PathOfExile 1. However, it looks like all of these monks that have been meditating have managed to tap into this entity of dreams and have managed to forge various links with it. Whether Chayula who dreamt serves the monks, or whether the monks are being tricked into serving Chayula and whatever Chayula's nightmarish demands are, that is something that we'll probably find out more about over time in PathOfExile 2. One skill that's undoubtedly exciting a number of players is Flicker Strike. This is coming back at rank 13, so it's not going to be something you'll have access to early in the game at all. But Flicker Strike is something that will teleport you next to a monster and allow you to make a powerful attack. However, in PathOfExile 1, this is a skill players have managed to find ways to sustain, so pretty much the only skill you use is Flicker Strike. I get a vibe that's not going to be sustainable in PathOfExile 2. I think you'll find instead that Flicker Strike will be something that you will use once against a powerful enemy, and then you'll have to work on recharging it somehow. Precise details of that undoubtedly will come out over time. Maybe they're already known, and I just haven't heard about them. We also have a number of Mace-themed skills, from Earthquake and Bone Shatter, which are found in PathOfExile 1, Shield Charge, which is a particularly interesting skill. Shield Charge is going to have a considerable cooldown in PathOfExile 2, so rather than being something that you use to zip around the map and then kill monsters with something else, Shield Charge feels like it'll be a big cooldown that you can fire off when you're surrounded by monsters. You really need to get somewhere right now, and it will do a lot of damage when you do so. And there's also Leap Slam returning, Earth Shatter returning, Sunder, Volcanic Fissure, Seismic Cry. Many of these are skills that will be familiar to PathOfExile 1 players. Fundamentally, most of the Mace-aligned skills can be divided into 3 categories. Hit the ground in order to cause earthquakes, hit the ground in order to cause volcanic eruptions, or donk something on the head. And they seem to be very, very good, especially at doing the latter. Interestingly, we're going to have Ancestral Warrior Totem appearing as an option very late in the game in the rank 13 skills. This is something that was recently removed from PathOfExile 1, where it felt like it was a mandatory buff for every melee character to use. Hopefully, with it being reflavored, it could be a really interesting skill. Crossbows have a lot of options for rank 13 skills. So you can see here you've got Siege Cascade, Plasma Blast, and Cluster Grenade all coming online very late in the game. Cluster Grenade in particular looks like it's something absolutely fantastic. Graniger Games did a little bit of a teaser on this. It has quite a long delay from the time that you set off the skill to when it deals damage, but it hits a large amount of the screen and it seems to hit multiple times in certain areas. In many ways, I feel this is a spiritual successor to Seismic Trap from PathOfExile 1, which of course has a very different theme, and other players have expressed that they feel it's very similar to Explosive Trap from PathOfExile 1. I think it's true for both of them, just that Seismic Trap feels to me more like that chunky and slow ability, whereas Explosive Trap in PoE 1 is more something that you spam. That said, it'd be really interesting to see if this skill lives up to the hype that is going on for it in my mind at the moment. I've definitely seen more people interested in the Mercenary and the Crossbow than I have in any other combination of class and weapon so far. There are a whole bunch of different skills here, starting with, of course, armor-piercing rounds, which is something that was endlessly memed after 2019 ExileCon, when Graniger Games had some very, very early playtest footage of PathOfExile 2, where the character would scream out armor-piercing rounds every time that you change your crossbow to use armor-piercing rounds. This was ridiculously annoying, even in the small amount of time that we saw it for, although, of course, it was hilarious to watch. One of the key things with the Mercenary is that it's going to feel like you are using modern weaponry, even though you are using a crossbow in terms of the actual game. So you'll have access to various things that will fire very fast, and they're intended to feel more like a modern day automatic weapon. And at the same time, you also have a number of these grenade skills. They're going to feel more like a modern day grenade launcher. Very slow, very methodical, very, very powerful when they go off. The final selection of skills that we've got here is the elemental skills. You'll notice that we're missing some. We don't have the primal skills. We don't have the axe skills. Several others that we're missing. But here in the elemental cluster, we've got the Ice Nova skill, Spark, Frostbomb, Flame Wall, Orb of Storms, Frostbolt, Ember Palisade. With the exception of the last of these, all of these are skills that PathOfExile 1 players will be familiar with. Of course, they probably work a little bit different in PathOfExile 2. Then we start seeing a few skills that are a bit more complicated after that. Arc, Incinerate, Solar Orb, which we don't know anything much about at all, Cold Snap, and then the hexes, Flammability, Hypothermia, and Conductivity, all of which allow you to curse an enemy so that they suffer additional damage. At least that's the way that it works in PathOfExile 1. Who knows if it's going to be a little bit different here. One thing that I think is particularly interesting is that they're taking the humble Fireball skill, something that in PathOfExile 1 is very mundane, very plain, and they're putting it up to quite a high tier. I'm hoping that this means that they're adding some extra complexity to what a Fireball does. There's a lot of different ways that a Fireball can be implemented into a game, and this is something that doesn't really hit very well in PathOfExile 1, but who knows? Maybe the Fireball in PoE 2 will just have some more interesting, more complicated mechanics that make it more exciting to fire off than the PoE 1 version. And finally, down the bottom, in rank 13, we have skills that are much more complicated. Temporal Chains, which is a good defensive curse in PathOfExile 1, but doesn't really help you kill monsters on its own. Then we have Flame Blast, which in PoE 1 takes a lot of charging up, but can do a lot of damage. Eye of Winter, which could hit a large area of the screen, but doesn't hit for very much damage. And so you need to work on ways to make it hit multiple times. And Lightning Conduit, which only works when the enemy has already been shocked by something else. PathOfExile 2 might decide to change some of these, but there's a lot of definitely really interesting things they can work around with, even if they keep them very close to what these skills do in PoE 1. The main thing, though, that we want to talk about today is going to, of course, be all of the different Ascendancy reveals that we got. Now, some of these are ones that I would have briefly discussed when I was doing my live stream yesterday, going through all of the information about PathOfExile 2 as it was revealed, but there's just a lot that you can't catch at the time, and I want to go through what is known. Fair warning, we do not know full information on any of these Ascendancies. We have partial information on each, and I'm really hoping Graniger Games start teasing these. It'd be really nice to see one of these every day for a little while, so that we can really break down all of the details of them. Starting with the Monk, though, the Acolyte of Chayula has Chayula's Gift. This is something that is going to give you considerable mitigation of chaos damage. This is quite hard to come by in PathOfExile 1, and so it'd be very welcome in PoE 2. But this is going to live or die based upon exactly how resistances work in PoE 2. In PathOfExile 1, your resistances start the game at 0, and you can increase them through gear up to a soft cap at 75 and a hard cap at 90. At 2 points throughout the campaign, however, your resistances get permanently lowered by 30. So this means that your base resistance is actually negative 60% by the time that you finish the campaign in PathOfExile 1. What this means is that Chayula's gift, that line that says chaos resistance is doubled, this is actually severely detrimental at various points in progression because it's going to take negative 60 and double it to negative 100. You're going to need quite a bit of gear to make that up. However, when you've got this gear, that's going to make things a lot better. 10% to maximum chaos resistance is a lot. That is really going to get you close to that hard cap of 90%, which may or may not be the same in PathOfExile 2 as it is in PathOfExile 1. And then chaos resistance is doubled is going to be something that's going to allow you to hit that 85% a lot easier than you could normally. However, one very, very important thing that we need to discuss with this, chaos resistance is doubled is a little bit of a dangerous stat sometimes, not only because of what we've already talked about with permanent decreases to your character's chaos resistance that exist in the PathOfExile 1 experience at least, but also because monsters might inflict temporary nerfs to your chaos resistance. The Cursed Despair in PathOfExile 1, which is returning in PathOfExile 2, possibly in a different form, this allows you to nerf the chaos resistance of a monster, and monsters are able to cast that on players too. Now, if you've got chaos resistances doubled from Chayula's gift, then this nerf is going to have double effect on you. So, if you want to make that work well, you're probably going to need to overcap your chaos resistance. It's not necessarily enough just to have 85%. If you want to be able to be safe once Despair is cast on you, you might actually need to build that up to 125% or some other number, and that's going to be a considerable amount of investment. So just keep that in mind. If you don't factor that in, you might have a couple of nasty surprises if you're relying upon Chayula's gift as your primary way of mitigating chaos damage. Additionally, in PathOfExile 1, there's a number of ways that you can convert incoming damage into chaos damage. One of the popular ways of doing this is the Keystone Divine Flesh, which is not something that you can just allocate by itself. You need a specific unique item in order to do it, but Divine Flesh is extremely, extremely strong. And this would be phenomenal in conjunction with Chayula's gift. Whether you can use these two things together in PathOfExile 2, we shall have to see. Ravenous Doubts comes up next and reads, Mana Leech is instant. This somewhat surprises me because the impression that I was under was that Life Leech and Mana Leech were being changed to be instant in PathOfExile 2. This was based upon some information that was spoiled a couple of days ago about the leech resistance stat that they were thinking of using. So it may be that that is not working the way that we originally thought, but I can pretty confidently say that if Ravenous Doubts didn't do something useful, it wouldn't exist. One thing I will say though is that according to people who have played at some of the public show-off events that Groningen Games have put on for PathOfExile 2, so this is things that were teasers in the lead up to yesterday's announcement, the monk was generally very tight on mana. So Ravenous Doubts might solve a lot of problems there for you. Finally though, we have Consuming Questions, which is an incredibly strong effect. This is something that makes a lot of sense even in the context of PathOfExile 1. What it's going to allow you to do is have your Mana Leech to also apply to Energy Shield. So it's going to allow you to get double benefit out of investment into mana recovery, by also having that be Energy Shield recovery, which is a type of life recovery. So this is something that could be extremely good, and I'm definitely thinking that this is perhaps one of the reasons you might consider being an Acolyte of Chayula if you are using very, very mana intensive skills. Waking Dream is something that I feel we lack the context to evaluate unless there's something that I missed about what it does. So that's going to be one that I'll leave out, except to say that it just sounds interesting, granting a skill from your Ascendancy there that thematically ties so closely to the Breach content. Embrace the Darkness, however, is an extremely, extremely interesting concept here. This one removes all of your spirit. Now, spirit is the spiritual successor to the concept of reserving mana. So removing all your spirit essentially removes your ability to reserve mana and to generate permanent effects on yourself. In exchange for this admittedly quite high cost of removing all of your spirit, you're going to gain an extra effective pool of health that's going to sit above your normal health, and it's going to be consumed first. This doesn't replenish itself via the normal mechanisms for replenishing health. Instead, it's going to be reserved for 10 seconds whenever you take damage. So for each life or energy shield lost to damage, reserve 1 darkness instead if possible. The size of this pool is going to be 5 times your character level plus an additional 100. So if you're level 30, it's going to be a 250 point pool. If you're level 90, it's going to be a 550 point pool. Now this on its own would not be worth giving up your ability to use auras and other effects, certainly not in PathOfExile 1, and probably not in PathOfExile 2 either. However, Grasp of the Void comes along as something you can spend 2 more points on, and this starts to make it all come together. Gain 1% of your damage added as extra chaos damage per 20 unreserved darkness. So if you're level 100, you might have 600 pool of darkness, and in this situation, if you haven't taken any damage in the last 10 seconds, that's all going to be unreserved. You're going to get 30% of your damage as extra chaos damage. That's a pretty chunky amount of extra damage. Note that this is a very different wording to what PathOfExile 1 would use as well. In PathOfExile 1, instead of having damage added as extra chaos damage, it would say your physical damage, some percentage of that gets added as extra chaos, or your elemental damage, some percentage of that. This quite simply wouldn't apply if you are already dealing chaos damage. But the text that's used on Grasp of the Void implies that even if you're only doing chaos damage, you will be able to benefit from this. PathOfExile 1's damage conversion mechanics are extraordinarily complex. There's something I'm not even going to attempt to go through all the details of here, but essentially there was no way to gain extra physical damage based upon the amount of damage that you did of other elements within PathOfExile 1. And in PathOfExile 1, you also couldn't gain lightning damage very often. You could if the base damage was physical, but if the base damage was cold or fire or chaos damage, you couldn't gain a percentage of that added as extra lightning. And that was because of the complex and crazy hierarchy that existed in order to support things like physical to lightning support, cold to fire support, Call of the Brotherhood, and other similar mechanics. That's not going to be in PathOfExile 2. It looks like they're going for a simpler approach that's probably not going to have quite as many crazy edge cases, but that's also not going to require an extreme degree of game knowledge in order to use effectively. I'm looking forward to that, even if I would have been one of the people that might have considered making a video about all of the complex nuances that would be involved otherwise. The second ascendancy we know a little bit about, but not very much, and that is the Witch's Blood Mage. We have Sanguimancy, which is going to have a really interesting effect where skills will gain a base life cost equal to their base mana cost. But whenever you kill a monster, it's going to generate a little life potion that basically automatically is applied when you walk over it. Now, that's going to be something interesting here because you are forced to take Sanguimancy if you're going into the Blood Mage. There is no agency. Your first 2 points must be Sanguimancy. You have no other options. However, you then get a huge amount of other options that open up once you deal with this interesting transformation of the way that mana and life work in PathOfExile. So with Crimson Power, you're going to gain Energy Shield from your equipped body armor, added as extra maximum life. So if you're using a chest piece that grants you 300 Energy Shield, then it's also going to grant you 300 life. That's only going to apply to your chest piece, but it's potentially a very strong defensive layer if the sorts of numbers available for Energy Shield and life are anything like they are in PathOfExile 1. Additionally, this is the PathOfExile game. We know that there'll be ways to scale damage or other beneficial effects based upon your maximum life pool as well. But then we have just the really cool stuff. Vitality Siphon, 10% of spell damage is leached as life. Gore Spike, 1% increased critical damage bonus, which I believe is the equivalent stat to critical strike multiplier in PathOfExile 1, per 20 life your character has. So if you're running around with 4,000 life, then suddenly your critical damage bonus is looking pretty high. What if you're running around with 10,000 life, if that's possible in PathOfExile 2? Well, at this point, this one alone is providing with 500 points of critical strike multiplier, which is a phenomenal amount. We'll have to see whether that's plausible or not, but it's definitely something that is looking very interesting. One last thing I want to point out that's really cool, and this is a constant thing throughout PathOfExile 2, have a look at the pathways that are traced on the Witch Blood Mage Ascendancy in general. You'll see that it traces out this heart, as they're wanting to try to convey the idea of this being a blood mage by taking the organ in the body that's most tied to blood and superimposing it over the entire Ascendancy. This is something that I feel is a really cool touch, and something I'm looking forward to seeing more of as we get all of the rest of the Ascendancies. Because it's not just the Blood Mage that has this cool setup, it's also the Sorceress's Chronomancer Ascendancy. We know very little about this one. We have Temporal Rift, which is a skill that is directly taken from PathOfExile 1. With Temporal Rift, it's a way that you can reset your character to the position that it was in, and by position I mean current mana total, current life total, current energy shield total, and also your location, the position that you were in a couple of seconds earlier. This is something that can be a very powerful emergency escape button if you're taking some terrible hit from a monster, or maybe a monster has forcibly repositioned you into something awful, or maybe the monster is doing a 1-2 punch against you, and the first hit is not going to kill you, the second hit alone wouldn't kill you, but you can't recover enough life between the two. Any of these sorts of situations, Temporal Rift can bail you out. This is a skill with a very high skill ceiling on it. It's going to take a lot of practice to get this feeling like you're using it right. Then we have Time Freeze, which locks enemies in place for a period of time. And we also have Unbound Encore, which grants Time Snap, which is an option that is going to reset all of your character's cooldowns. So there's a lot of flexible things that you can do with the Chronomancer. How powerful this is, I think we're really going to need to test in practice. I do think there's some really cool things going on here, but whether it ends up living up to the hype is something that we'll have to work out once we get to actually play with this thing. The Ranger's Deadeye will look quite similar, but not exactly the same for people who have played this Ascendancy in PathOfExile 1. Endless Munitions causes skills to fire one additional projectile. You'll notice that this is a smaller number than you get in PathOfExile 1, but it does look like every single projectile is going to be a more important increase than it would be in PathOfExile 1. Your second option, Eagle Eyes, causes you to have no accuracy penalty at distance. The exact wording of this, I'm not sure about. I think that they're trying to avoid some of the situations from PathOfExile 1 where projectiles can just chain off screen and start killing monsters that you haven't even seen yet. So that may be the intention here. They're adding in an accuracy penalty there, but the exact mechanics of that will be things we'll need to learn more about later. Gathering Winds is the last option here. This is something that is quite different to PathOfExile 1. It still causes you to gain Tailwind on skill uses, but you lose all Tailwind when hit. So this is going to be something you're going to want to use alongside a fairly careful playstyle, where you're staying at some distance from enemies and striking them from range, which fits the class fantasy of a Deadeye very, very well. The Infernalist is probably the Ascendancy that sings to me the most so far. This is just a very unique take on the idea of a fire and brimstone witch. This just does something a bit different to a lot of other RPGs. The closest thematic match that I can think is maybe the Warlock from various versions of World of Warcraft, but even then, there's a lot of differences here. This is a spellcaster that sets things on fire, this is a spellcaster that conjures a bunch of minions, and this is a spellcaster that combines the two things together. We have a demon form that you can turn into, we have a hellhound that you can summon in this Ascendancy, and we have probably the most interesting thing of all, Pyromantic Pact. This is something that causes your entire mana system to change the way that it works, and instead of running out of arcane power the way that a general power fantasy works for arcane casters in games like PathOfExile, instead you're going to have unlimited access, but it's going to be something that can then cause a massive backlash that can do a lot of damage to you. So your maximum mana is going to be replaced by maximum Infernal Flame. Instead of spending mana for spell costs, you will build up Infernal Flame. This is going to mean that you have more and more flame building up inside your character. Once you overload this, so once your Infernal Flame reaches its maximum, you're going to take maximum life and energy shield as fire damage. So if your character has 3,000 life and 1,000 energy shield, you're going to suffer a single hit for 4,000 fire damage. You're going to need a lot of mitigation to survive that, because if you don't have any fire mitigation, that's just going to outright slay you. Of course, it's pretty standard in PathOfExile 1 at least that players will have at least 75% fire resistance, especially if they're using some sort of effect that deals backlash damage to themselves in the form of fire, and you can certainly go higher than 75% as well with a bit more investment. Finally, we have Bringer of Flame, which causes you when you are not at low Infernal Flame. So your Infernal Flame is over a certain threshold. In PathOfExile 1, that is now 50% or more, but in earlier days of PathOfExile 1, that threshold would have been 35%. We'll have to get the exact definition in PoE 2. But when you are not at low Infernal Flame, when you've got quite a chunk of it built up, all damage from you and from your minions contributes to both Ignite, Chance, and Magnitude. The exact mechanics of this are still a mystery, and we'll have to find out more about them. I'd love to see a write-up from PathOfExile 2 devs as to exactly how Ignite works in PathOfExile 2. In Path of Exile 1, there's a bunch of shenanigans going on with it, but fundamentally, Ignite's just a way to cause an existing hit to continue dealing damage over time to a monster, and you can scale the hit, you can scale the damage over time, whichever of them you choose to. And one of the main benefits to Ignite in Path of Exile 1 is that it's something that can be very easily made contagious. In Path of Exile 1, Ignites can spread through a number of mechanics. There are Ignite proliferation mechanics, such as Ignite proliferation support, and there's also similar but fundamentally different mechanics, such as those that are found on the unique items Beric's Respite and also Abrath's Hooves, that can also spread the love, spread the warmth, so as to make sure that it's not just you that's feeling nice and warm and fuzzy inside, but it's all of the monsters that are attacking you as well. How exactly that works in Path of Exile 2 is anyone's guess, and I'd like to see a write-up of that at some point. Next, we have the Monk Invoker. So we already had the Chayula Disciple. Now we have the Invoker as another option that you can go with a Monk. Very, very different class fantasy here. This time your Monk remains more serene and doesn't give in to corruption the way that Chayula's Disciples do. Now, your first option is a channel that you can use in order to double your energy shield on your character. I really want to see what this feels like in practice. I have no idea whether this is going to be something that you can just keep up all the time, or whether it's going to be something that's really disruptive to use, whether it's something you use for a short period of time when you know a big hit is coming, or whatever it ends up being. It'll be interesting to see, but we don't really know as yet. I Am the Blizzard and I Am the Thunder are interesting. Earlier when we were discussing the other monk, the Chayula monk, we discussed the mechanics of gaining damage as extra of an element, and how different it is in Path of Exile 2 to Path of Exile 1, some of the reasons for that difference, and some of the consequences. But the key thing is that allows you to gain additional damage as cold damage, even if the base damage that you're dealing with your skill happens to be fire. Now, I Am the Blizzard and I Am the Thunder give you two different ways to get this. You may want one, you may want both. That's something we're going to have to think long and hard about once we get some more information about the way that the monk is built. However, we also have some mechanics that allow you to spread ailments, but these are intentionally powered down from similar sorts of mechanics you might have seen in Path of Exile 1. So when you freeze an enemy, that creates chilled ground with I Am the Blizzard. This is a way that you can spread the love from that freeze to other monsters, but not in a super powerful way. Likewise, 25% chance when you inflict shock on an enemy that you create shocked ground that can then shock other enemies that are close by. Again, quite a bit weaker than the existing things in Path of Exile 1, where you would automatically propagate your shock to other monsters. There's a few ways that you can do that. However, because it seems like ailments are going to be a bit harder to inflict, this may actually mean that they're more impactful to inflict, and so this may end up being a very solid choice anyway, as something that you can use in order to gain quite a bit of an extra boost in combat. These, of course, are just straight up damage increases as well, and the damage multipliers don't seem to go as high in Path of Exile 2 as they do in PoE 1, which should mean that it's not some drama if you end up holding off on your Ascendancy for a little while, going back and doing that Sanctum content or doing that Ultimatuming content. Once you're powerful enough that it's going to be more trivial, you'll be able to get that bonus power then, and it's not going to be as devastating as delaying it in Path of Exile 1 can be. And I Shall Rage is going to grant you Unbound Avatar, which is something very similar to one of the things that was added for the Warden Ascendancy in Path of Exile 1 recently. And then we have And Scatter Them to the Winds, which is something that generates its own skill that we don't know anything really about. Elemental Expression will come up when you score a melee critical hit. So the Invoker is very much an elemental and meditation themed monk that's going to use cold damage and lightning damage, but is going to eschew some of the chaos themes that you find in the Chayula Ascendancy. And now we have one of the most innovative, the Gemling Legionnaire for the Mercenary. This has some really cool stuff built into it. Crystalline Potential is something that is a 4-pointer, so it's going to be a high opportunity cost to take, and it's going to grant 12 to the quality of all skill gems. We don't know how significant quality will be in Path of Exile 2. I feel like it's too early to say much about this at the moment. But then we have Integrated Efficiency and Thaumaturgical Infusion. I misread Thaumaturgical Infusion the first time I saw it. It's very important to note that this is all about support gems. It is not about skill gems. This means you can get these numbers really, really high once you get solidly into endgame, and you're able to start affording to get 6 links on all of your gems. I feel like we need to recap on the way that support gems are going to work in Path of Exile 2. So you're going to start out with your skill gems being 3 linked. This is the default. you can then apply a low tier Jeweler's Orb to permanently upgrade a single gem from 3 to 4, then a medium tier Jeweler's Orb to permanently upgrade from 4 to 5, and then you can upgrade it to 6 through the use of a Grandmaster's Jeweler's Orb. We don't know how rare these are going to be, we don't know how precious they're going to be, and we don't know how late in progression you're going to start seeing those 6-link Jeweler's Orbs, whether they're going to be something that is a major milestone for your character even to get their first one, or whether it's going to be something that's much more routine and mundane. Early in Path of Exile 1's history, getting a 6-link was a massive, massive endgame chase goal, whereas in more recent times it's become much more mundane, much more routine, and something that people plan around getting on day 1 or day 2 of a league. That may not be the case in Path of Exile 2, but maybe it is. Whatever the case, the scarcity of these Grandmaster's Jeweler's Orbs in particular is going to have a big impact on how good Thaumaturgical Infusion feels, whether it's something that is just a top-end power gamer tool, or whether it's something that's played around with by a much larger section of the player base. More on each of these nodes now. So Integrated Efficiency is going to give you 3 additional skill slots. This feels like it's really good for the Mercenary, who can probably carry a lot of different situational skill gems around, and of course can use them to then do things that may not always be useful, but that sometimes are extremely good. A good example of a super situational skill that some of you might be familiar with from Path of Exile 1, one of the crowd control skills, whether it be Decoy Totem, whether it be Void Sphere, people use these in different ways. They're not used very much, but they are something that can be really, really powerful at certain times. And Integrated Efficiency is just going to let you bring more of a toolbox along with you. Thaumaturgical Infusion, though, is then going to reward you for having all of these additional gem slots filled in, because it's going to increase your maximum resistances based upon the number of support gems that you've socketed anywhere on your character. These will be socketed into the skill gems themselves. So essentially, Integrated Efficiency is not just giving you 3 additional skill slots, it's also giving you the ability to fit 15 additional support gems on your character. Using these together, it looks like you'll be able to get more than 20% total added to your maximum resistances through the 2 of these Ascendancy options. So a lot of potential power there. And finally, we have Adaptive Capability. Attribute requirements of gems can be satisfied by your highest attribute. In Path of Exile 1, this would be considered rubbish, but in Path of Exile 2, it's a bit of an open question as to just how high our attributes are or are not going to get, and also how high those requirements are going to be on level 20 versions of gems, and whether there's anything past level 20. Are we going to be able to get level 21 gems? Are we going to have something akin to Path of Exile 1's Awakened support gems? In which case, some of the attribute requirements might end up feeling oppressively high, and Adaptive Capability might then be able to save you 10 or 15 or even 30 points on your passive tree, in which case it's going to be something you're definitely going to take. In any case, the entirety of this Ascendancy seems very focused on flexibility, which calls back in a lot of ways to Path of Exile 1's Scion and the Ascendancy there. And then we have the Ranger's Pathfinder Ascendancy, which has a lot of interesting things going on, but we really cannot say much about whether this is going to be strong or not yet. Fulminating Concoction and Bleeding Concoction are options. These will allow you to throw projectiles that will either inflict fire damage or inflict bleeds on enemies. Presumably, given the sort of setup of what's there, there'll also be one that will deal chaos damage, there'll be one for cold damage, and there'll be one for lightning damage. But I could be wrong on that, maybe there's something entirely different. In Path of Exile 1, the concoction skills consume your life blast charges, and we'll have to see whether the Pathfinder follows in those footsteps or not. Contagious Contamination is one of the more interesting things in the Pathfinder Ascendancy so far. The most damaging poison on enemies you kill is spread to other enemies within 1.5 meters. There are a number of ways that a very similar effect in Path of Exile 1 is built around, centered on getting one very big poison onto an enemy, and using cluster jewels to stack lots of copies of low tolerance in order to boost up that damage to enormous levels. Now, we won't have cluster jewels in Path of Exile 2, but there's probably going to be ways that you can invest into a single poison, making it as deadly as possible, and then killing the poison monster and ensuring that its friends also get to enjoy some of the experience of being poisoned with such a devastating poison. And then we have Overwhelming Toxicity, which is something that would not do anything useful in Path of Exile 1, and implies that poison is going to function in a different way in the new game to how it does in PoE 1. This doubles the number of poisons you can inflict on enemies, which in Path of Exile 1 is an unbound amount, you can just have as many as you want, but it's going to come at the cost of 35% less poison duration. This is potentially really powerful, but it's interesting that it actually has anti-synergy with Contagious Contamination, and you have to spec Contagious Contamination in order to pick this up. That's a little bit unfortunate, but it's probably going to be something people are going to take for the numbers if they're able to hit enemies multiple times reasonably quickly. And finally, running Assault allows you to continue moving at a higher speed while you're using skills. So you're always able to fire skills while moving, but doing so slows you down. This is going to reduce the amount that your speed is nerfed by. The Sorceress Stormweaver has a number of things that relate to shock, as well as Elemental Storm, which is going to be something that you can trigger when you critically hit with spells. We don't know very much about the way that this Ascendancy works. I feel like this is the one we know the least about, but the keystone art for it is absolutely amazing. Hoping to learn more about this one, but there's not really much to cover at the moment. And next we have the Warrior Titan. The Warrior Titan is going to be very much focused on hitting hard with weapons. Slam skills that you use have a chance to cause aftershocks, which is a mechanic I believe that is very similar to PathOfExile 1's Earthquake skill. Now, number 2 is Crushing Impacts, which is something that appears to work differently to how the same text would apply in PathOfExile 1. PathOfExile 1, crushing a monster means that it has nerfed physical damage mitigation for a period. I think instead, though, that this is going to be something that is going to assist in applying stun, and that's because Surprising Strength comes along and gives you 40% more damage against enemies that are suffering from a heavy stun. So these two seem to be working together, one's a prerequisite for the other, and it wouldn't surprise me if that's the way that that's going to work. Crushing Impacts helps you stun enemies and inflict these heavy stuns, and then Surprising Strength lets you tear them apart once you've already applied this stun to them. The Titan feels like it's going to be a very methodical playstyle where you're going to build up to a stun period and then have a massive, massive burst damage window. At least that's my feeling from what we know so far. Also in the Warrior class, we have the Warbringer Ascendancy. Small amount of information here, and this is potentially some of the more interesting shenanigans. We have a skill that is going to cause you to gain Ancestral Spirits, which will then be triggered whenever you summon a totem. That one we know very little about. Jade Heritage is going to cause you to grant a stack of Jade every second. How that works again, we don't really know. So far, we've got a couple of things we don't know much about, but then we have the real killer. Corpses in your presence, which in PathOfExile 1 means within 8 meters of you, presumably it'll be similar in PoE 2, they explode when you Warcry. This then deals 25% of the corpse's life as physical damage. This is a tremendously big corpse explosion, especially given that with Great Wolf's Howl, you can ignore the cooldowns on your Warcries. You can find a whole bunch of corpses on the ground, pull a scary monster to it, one that might otherwise be unbeatable for you, and then you can set off Warcaller's Bellow, and then you can cause all those corpses to explode, and hopefully take this terrifying monster that you couldn't otherwise slay to the grave with them. And the final Ascendancy we've got some information on is the Mercenary Witchhunter Ascendancy. So the Gemling option that is all about rewarding versatility, and now we have the Witchhunter, which is a very, very different class power fantasy. Now, Witchbane causes enemies to have maximum concentration equal to 40% of their maximum life. You can break their concentration when you hit them equal to the amount of damage that you deal. So if you could burst an enemy down from 100% to 60%, then this is going to break all of their concentration. At this point, they're not going to be able to cast spells, at least that's the way I believe it works. Enemies regain 10% of their concentration every second if they haven't lost concentration in the past 5 seconds. So this is very much a spell hunter ability. This is something that's going to nerf the ability of monsters to cast spells if you're unable to slay them outright with your first hit. Judge, Jury, and Executioner is going to cause your first hit to deal tremendous additional damage. And then we have Obsessive Rituals, which we really don't know enough about to say much on. This grants a sorcery ward, but does so at a very big expense to your armor and evasion rating. And how that works, we're going to have to find that out once we get more information. Zealous Inquisition, though, this is what we're looking for. This is the really interesting stuff. 10% chance for enemies you kill to explode, dealing 100% of their maximum life as physical damage, and this chance is doubled against undead and demons. Now, 10% might not seem like a lot, but if you've got a busy pack, this is going to be a pretty substantial amount of corpses going boom. What this will tend to mean in practice, if you can get 50 monsters into one place, once you start killing the weaker ones will take the bigger ones with them, unless the bigger ones are miles tankier than the weaker ones. Anyways, that is a quick overview of what we know about 12 of the Ascendancies and what we know about a whole bunch of skill gems. I'm going to fire up a question before I leave it here though, and that is, which of these Ascendancies are you most interested in so far? Does any of them jump out at you as phenomenally interesting, or are you still taking a wait and see attitude like I'm doing myself, holding off until there's a bit more information and we start finding out more about the other ones in order to then decide, okay, this is the one that happens to sing to me the loudest? And also at the same time, are any of the skill gems jumping out at you as particularly exciting just from their names or the small amounts that we know about them so far? With that in mind, I'll leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.